We'll resume with agenda item number 16, and we're at that portion of CR 20-12 on the fur-bearing animals. Mr. Wilson Hume.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just go through this from beginning to end, and then we can have any discussion that you would like preceding that. So, for Beaver, Menken, Muskrat season statewide, October 1st through April 30th, and all of these dates are for the next, similar to the upland, these are for the next 2 years. Otter, in open areas of Elko, Eureka, Humboldt, Lander, and Pershing counties from October 1st to May 31st. There's some special regulations there that's unchanged from past years that includes the counties that are closed and actions to take if under the circumstances of incidental take. Kit and red fox statewide October 1st to the last day of February. Bobcat season, and this represents a departure from the last regulation you saw. This is a reduction in the season dates of roughly 21 days. So the seasons proposed for Bobcat are statewide the second Saturday in November through the third Sunday in February, and that season would be closed to non-residents. And then gray fox, we always try to get that to match the Bobcat season, so this is also a reduction in season dates statewide, second Saturday in November through the third Sunday in February, also closed to non-residents. And then on page 13 and 14 are the proposed Bobcat sealing dates, and I won't go through all those dates. There are no departures from what you saw in the past other than the Carson City sealing date. We moved that date from late in December to mid-January, and the reason for that was because it was so early in the season on that December date that there wasn't a lot of participation on that sealing date, so we just moved it back a few weeks to try to pick up some more people there. So
I have a question. We received some correspondence with respect to the support material, which is some of the Bobcat data.
Yes, sir.
And there were specific questions related to the total kittens to 100 total adult population ratio. And if I'm reading it correctly, it was 7. And there were some questions whether or not that single data point should require further adjustment or adjustment to the Bobcat season. So if you could address that issue or question, or someone from the department could, I'd like to get an understanding of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to address that for you and the commission. So similar to the protocol that Sean went through with Sage-Grouse, with certain key things that trigger season changes, we have something similar for that for Bobcats. Just like on the Sage-Grouse, we look at a 3-year moving average on each of these, but we look at a combination of production, adult male to adult female ratios, and then a combination of effort per Bobcat effort and total harvest. So I collectively look at all those. Each of them kind of gives me a different view of what the population's doing. So the annual production for Bobcats was 17.5 kittens per 100, which is one of the lowest ones we've seen in the history of it has been lower, but not much in the history of our data, which goes back to 1980, our data string. So when we look at the adult male to adult female ratio, back on the production, the 3-year moving average is 35 kittens per 100. So it's really common in wildlife to look at these 3-year moving averages because it sort of smooths out the hills and the valleys, so you're not making wild regulation changes in seasons. This is something that started back in the 1940s in the waterfowl world and the flyways, so that you don't go from the most liberal season to the most restricted season from one year to the next. Try to smooth out the hills and the valleys a little bit. it's still responsive with 3 years to what the population's doing, and that's the reason why we work off of these 3-year averages. So on adult males to adult females, that for the annual number was 1.48 adult males to adult females. This is a really important indicator in cat species. Male, female, we look at this also in mountain lions frequently. The males have a much larger territory than the females, so they're more apt to be captured, and that's the reason why you see that for every 100 females, we're catching 148 males. Males, however, have a shorter life expectancy. They live a much harder life fighting for territories, scrapping to protect those territories. So when you have a ratio that's much higher male to female, it's a good indication that the population overall is stable and in good condition. So what you don't want to see in the cat population is that number ever move towards a 1-to-1 type ratio, and if so, that means that you're really over harvesting your population. So that number for the annual 1.48, and for the year, or the 3-year moving average is 1.55. So on each of these components that we look at in this protocol, I'm comparing these to the long-term average for each of these. So I have a 95%, little statistics there, 95% confidence interval around the mean. And so if it's within that 95% confidence interval, then I call that the standard. If it's above it for production and adult males, then that's a positive. If it's below it, then it's a negative. The combination of effort and harvest, and I combine those because you want to look at them collectively. If your effort is really, really high and your harvest is really, really low, that's an indicator that there's not a lot of bobcats on the landscape. The transverse of that is if you're really high harvest and really low effort, then that means there's a lot of bobcats. So that's why I look at those collectively. We don't have any way to project anything else. I could have produced this for you, but I graph it out and look at where it lands on this graph to figure out where it's at. So for effort, we were at 182 for the year and 170 for the 3-year moving average, which is within the standard, the 95%. And with harvest, we were at 2,027 for the year, which is the standard. The 3-year moving average was 2,780, which is slightly below above. So an effort and harvest above the standard is bad. It's the opposite direction. So anyway, slightly above. So it was slightly above the standard there. So I take all of those biological factors and I look at this protocol that we have, and it, similar to the one Sean went through, it tells me where the seasons should land. Should we be in a liberal season? Should we be in what I call the standard season, which is the standard season, the long-term average for bobcat seasons, that's the standard, or a restrictive season. So when I look at each of these factors that our protocol landed within the standardized season, which is a departure from the last 2 years, which was in the liberal season, which was 121, 122 days was what the last 2 years were in. And I proposed the 100-day season here on the standardization based off of this biological information.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. Excuse me. Any other questions? Commissioner Hubbs?
Just looking over this last graph, I was curious as to, we have a total running from management areas 1 to 29, correct?
Correct.
And then it goes into R1, R2, R3, Basin, and Mojave. I just wasn't sure what that meant. Like, is that not part of the total, or is that additional to the total?
So the total, the blue line there, that's the statewide total if I combine all the management areas. So the R1, R2, R3 are departmental regions, Region 1, Region 2, and Region 3. And then our state ecologically is divided into 2 ecoregions, the Basin ecoregion and the Mojave, which is in the southern part of the state.
Okay.
So I review all of those and I look at those. One of the concerns statistically, by breaking those down, and I do look at them and consider them, but a lot of times my sample size gets quite small, and especially by the management areas, the sample sizes are quite small. So I look at the statewide totals, and that way I'm confident in my sample size, and therefore my statistics are truer.
Vice Chair East.
No, so I'm sorry, or Vice Chair East, I'm almost done. So we're saying in the basin there seems to be further take than the southern regions, or whatever region 1, 2, and 3 stands for. I mean, like, the basin has a higher adult take, and I'm just like, where is that and what's going on there?
Right, so the basin ecoregion represents about 2/3 of the state. So that the Mojave is primarily takes in Clark County, the southern portions of Nye County, across its, and I don't know how to explain where that line is in the state without a map, but it's a much smaller part of the state than
From the Great Basin to Mojave
from the Great
Desert,
Basin to the Mojave
basically.
Desert, right? That's exactly what those are.
Mm-hmm.
Pipelines are not, there's overlap there. Pipelines at the bottom are inclusive of the units up top, and even the pipelines at the bottom, there's redundant representation of the data in those. So the first 3 are the regions, which are western, eastern, and southern, which are independent of the basin, Great Basin population, and Mojave population. So they aren't 5 big distinct areas with redundant data. It's just 2 different ways of representing geographically broader areas.
So R1 through R3 represents the basin. The basin is represented by the
No,
three above.
I
No,
think,
R3 also has Mojave. So think of them totally independent. There's the basin population and Mojave population, which is 2 large subdivides, and then a totally independent and different way of looking at it is across 3 geographic regions. So there are data that are in R1, 2, and 3 that may also be present in basin or Mojave.
Okay, so we just know a lot more bobcats are taken up north in the Great Basin, right? About 4 times more than what is taken in the Mojave.
It's a much larger geographic area. The portion of the state that comprises the Great Basin is much larger than the portion of the state that is part of the Mojave ecosystem.
Okay, and so we know we're looking for what ratio are we looking to for adult, female, and male again? Because we're at the total here is saying that we have 1,050 males and 708 females, correct?
Right, so if you look
Statewide.
on that sheet, Commissioner Hubbs and Commission, under in the middle of it is Bobcat ratio data. You'll find the 4th column over in that middle section that says adult males per 100 adult females, and the blue line there shows what that ratio is: 149 males per 100 adult females.
I have 148.
I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on.
Okay.
148.
Okay, so we're saying we should have 148 males to females, and we have 1,050 males to 708 females.
So the 148, that's calculated from what the data you're seeing on the left-hand side, how many males and how many females. I calculate this out, and this is the actual data that it
Oh,
came up.
understood. So you're saying we have 148 males to females, where we should have 1 to 1.
No, we don't want 1-to-1. That's
Oh, we don't want 1 to 1. Okay, what do we want?
we want. 1 second. So the standard for that is we want to range between 137 to 146 males per 100 females, and that would be the 95% confidence around the standard.
Okay, so I see you're saying we're a little high.
We're higher, which is good. We want, on that particular one, we want to be higher. That means that the population's healthy. We're not taking too many out of the population. That's what this is an indicator of, because if you start, so what happens is because it's easier to catch a male bobcat.
Right, because the bigger territory.
Right. So if you're over harvesting, pretty quick you'll run out of males, and you'll keep trying, and you'll start catching more females.
Okay, understood.
So then what happens is that ratio will get closer and closer to a 1-to-1, and God forbid it would go even more females than males. That would be a real alarm. Even 1-to-1 would alarm me greatly, and we would take some serious action. But so what you want to see is that as long as you're catching a lot more males than females, that means there's still a lot of bobcats on the landscape, and you're not taking too many out of it, that you're not impacting the population.
Has there been any studies, though, in terms of why males may be more, when you're saying ticking, I'm assuming you mean by trapping?
Yes.
Okay,
They're not all trapped. A lot of these are hunted also.
Could it be potentially that males, for some reason, are more prone to be trapped than females for other reasons than we know?
It's largely because their territory is so much larger. So in one male's territory, it might encompass anywhere from 3 to 6 female territories. And because they're traveling a lot more, they're more susceptible to being harvested, because your probability of encountering them is higher.
Understood. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Vice Chair East.
Thank you. Russell, I just have one question. How do you arrive at the total trap days?
So, Nevada state law requires that for every bobcat that's harvested, those who harvest them have to turn in data. We get 100% of our harvest data on bobcats, because bobcats require, both from state law and federal law, that they receive a tag. So in order to, before you can get the tags for your bobcats, which are a requirement by law, you have to provide the department with the harvest data, where they were caught, what you caught, the sex of what you caught, and also the lower jaw from each bobcat. And we use all of that information to derive these numbers that you're looking at here. So they provide how many traps they ran in a trap line to harvest that bobcat and how many days it took. And so between those two items, I can figure out, I get an average trap days.
Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Russell, so what's driving the reduction is the trapper data, the harvest numbers, not to go down to a standard season. Is that being driven by the effort?
It's being driven by production is what drove it down.
All right. So they're not, yeah, okay.
Right. So I look at everything. So if everything was down, then the protocol would push us to even a more restrictive season than what we're showing here.
Regardless of how many deviations from 95%.
Right. It's all based off of where does it fall? Where does each one of these items fall within their own standard, and then collectively, how does that look?
Okay. So when was the last restricted season or closed season? And what was driving those? I guess those are the two questions I have.
Right. So let's see if I can find it on here. This is a spreadsheet that I don't typically print it out. So, all right. So working backwards. So the last 2 seasons, we had liberal seasons, which, if you recall back 3 years ago, we had back-to-back the highest production that the second highest production back-to-back years we've ever recorded. So so we had 2 years of liberal. Before that, we had a year of the standard season, and before that, we had 2 years of the restrictive season. So it's been within, what is that, 4 years since the last restrictive?
And what was driving those?
So the years of the restrictive season, production was below the standard, as was the adult male-female ratio dropped slightly below the standard, and effort and harvest were both above the standard, which were all negatives, and so it drove it into that. I mean, they were just outside of my standard, but it was anything outside of the standard puts it.
And you're just working with the 95% confidence level, the one standard deviation.
Correct.
Okay. So when was the last time seasons were closed?
The seasons haven't been closed to as far as my records go.
I know Joel can probably answer that off the top of his head.
Ever. There was some really short days or years in the 80s. There was some really short seasons then, but we haven't had anything closed since I have records back to since Bobcats became a fur bearer, which was 76.
So today's we've heard this stuff a little bit off and on, but I appreciate you putting it in a little more context and understanding that there's going to be questions today and stuff. So it's helped a lot for you to explain what you did. Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions before I ask for public comment? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and take public comment on that portion of CR 20-12 for fur-bearing animals.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay.
You just need to speak loudly into the microphone, please.
Good morning. First, I wanted to commend Commissioner Hubbs on discussing the topic that is acutely relevant to humans and to wildlife. There's really no need for me to comment on bag limits and seasons. There's really nothing I can do or say to alter the outcome of the vote, since this isn't a truly participatory process. But I would like to say a few words regarding zoonotic diseases. I understand trapping can be helpful in times of an outbreak, but not without specific targeting. Depletion of fox populations has been correlated with a higher prevalence of Lyme disease. There is a confirmed transmission of coronavirus this year from a mink to a human with a symptomatic infection. Bird flu in Minnesota resulted in 2015 resulted in the death of millions of birds. And some bird flus have a higher mortality than 50% in humans. We have had outbreaks of bubonic plague.
Can you
just in this
speak up
area.
just a little bit? I can hear you, but I'm scared the record's not going to hear you, ma'am.
Okay, thanks.
Can you speak up?
We have had outbreaks of bubonic plague in this area requiring signage. Given all these things, as you can imagine, trapping small predators might not be the best for us, since rodent populations could increase, and we really have no idea if this is happening. And as a result of this, rodents are more likely to spread disease to humans. Additionally, all small predators are needed to control the outbreak of wildlife disease. Who would be better to control an outbreak of disease in rabbits than coyotes and bobcats and other predators? We can't do it. It'll spread just like chronic wasting disease has, and it's really too late there. To close, I am appreciative that the department is having discussions on these issues, but I am extremely concerned that trappers' rights will continue to supersede those of public health and Nevada's wildlife.
I'll try and talk loud. I couldn't hear what Kathy said, but I think it had something to do with COVID. But anyway, first, for the record, my name is Joel Blakesley. I'm representing the Nevada Trappers Association. And the first thing I want to say is thanks to Commissioners Johnston and Valentine for their service. And we'll miss seeing you here. course, you'll probably show up, but anyway. Second, the Nevada Trappers Association supports the fur bearer season recommended by NDOW across the board, everything from muskrats to bobcats. And I just wanted to make a few comments on bobcats. Russell did a very good job about it, but I'll say that I've testified in front of this board for over 40 years regarding bobcat seasons. I know a lot about what's went on. I know why we had short seasons in the 80s. We floundered around and tried to figure things out. The result of all this is we have the absolute best data in the world on bobcats right here in Nevada. And I would suggest probably the best management system as well. You know, the protocols and stuff are good. There's some concern about the reproduction rates. You know, wildlife populations come and they go, you know, everything does that. It ebbs and flows. There's more than one thing that we look at, though. And regarding the reproduction rate, like Russell mentioned, we had record reproduction in the past 5 years, back to back. It's quite possible that those animals, which are now adult animals, have filled up the range to carrying capacity. Another biological factor that happens with young bobcats is the old toms will take over the primary habitat and force the young into the secondary and tertiary areas, and it's stressful on them. The other thing is you get intra-specific competition with the toms killing the kittens. That's very common in the feline species. Anyway, that cohort from a few years ago with record production are all adult animals now filling the habitat. The male to female ratios are extremely high right now. In fact, they fall outside of the normal average. To put that into context a little bit, and this isn't a direct correlation, but think about your deer herds and your male to female ratios. We're swimming in tall cotton when we're doing $30 per 100 does. $30 per 100 does. What are we talking about for male bobcats to female bobcats? 148 to 100. Now, we don't survey bobcats the same way we do deer, but the male to female ratio is the way we measure the exploitation of the resource. So using this data, it shows that we're not exploiting the resource hardly at all. My personal feelings, which I've said to you, is I don't think we have any effect on it really to speak of. But we do this. Density dependence is one of the things that happens with carrying capacity. The harvest effort, the total harvest, the total trappers all fall within the normal range. One thing that I can add that's anecdotal is a projection going forward. The pelt prices for bobcats are like a half to a third of what they were just a few years ago. And nobody sees them going up. And that's because the market for those animals goes to the Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. And you can almost measure it by the price of oil. And we know what the price of oil's doing. I mean, hell, I was buying gas at Costco for $1.75, you know, just not too long ago. I don't see that changing right away. And then we all know about China. China is the other big driver of the market. So the market's likely to be suppressed for any number of years, which brings up almost the last point. If you shorten the season down too far to where we don't gather enough data to have a statistically significant data set to look at, I mean, we're going to lose what we've been gathering for 40 plus years now. I remember in the 90s when this last happened with the prices. I mean, we were getting 5 bobcats harvested in a management unit. What does that mean? When you start talking about males to females or kittens to females, there just simply isn't enough numbers there to be significant.
Mr. Blakesley, you're reaching your time limit. If you could wrap it up for us, please.
I'll say one last thing. Hemorrhagic disease, we've dealt with it with muskrats for 1,000,000 years. I'm certain that it's been going on for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comment? Seeing no further public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission. Any further discussion or questions? Commissioner Hubbs?
I believe, I mean, just looking at this data from the bobcats in particular, we had a really wet season like a couple years ago. And I was thinking it was just last year. You know how time goes by, but they're like, oh, it was 3 years ago. So we had a really, I mean, I had pictures of neighbors in my area of Henderson with bobcats on their stone wall. There were a lot of bobcats. So I don't necessarily, I think it's lovely that we had that many bobcats, but I think a lot of it was due to weather and production in general. You know, with weather, with rain, especially down where we live, there comes a lot of obviously rodents and rabbits and things of that nature, which are prey to bobcat. And so we had bobcats. We had them all around, and it was lovely. But I don't like the whole idea of the whole commercialization of our trapping. I understand that it is a market, and we have to understand that it is commercialization. But I don't like to compare our bobcats to crude oil. That's just not how my brain goes. I mean, I don't look at it that way, and I hope that we're making our decisions on today on what's best for our bobcat populations, not what's best on the tread sector. You know, like what's best for our bobcat pelts. I don't think that's how we should be making our judgments, although I'm sure potentially that could be a pointer factor for many in our community, but I don't go in line with that thought process. I would rather look at what our populations are saying. If they're saying that our male populations are higher than our females, which shows that our populations are well managed, I feel comfortable with that. But never would I consider what crude oil is, or gasoline, or bobcat pelts on the free market in making our decisions. And I'm just going to say that today. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional comments? Vice Chair East?
I'll make a motion to approve that section of CR 20-12 for fur-bearing animals as presented by the department.
Okay, I have a motion by Vice Chair East, seconded by Commissioner Barnes, to approve that portion of CR 20-12 for fur-bearing animals. Is everyone clear on the motion? I'm going to make one comment. I hear that this was not a truly participatory process. I wanted a specific answer to a specific question today before I voted in favor of this regulation. And I was able to get a very specific answer to a specific question in response to correspondence I received from those who were opposed to this regulation. So the notion that I ignore it and don't listen to it is just absolutely false, because it was the correspondence I received that prompted me to ask a question to Mr. Russell Wolstenholme that resulted in the discussion we had today. Participatory and listening does not equal agreement. So I find it offensive for people to stand before this commission and say it's not a participatory process when it's the public participation that resulted in the questions that were posed to the department here before this motion was made. And with that, I'll call for the question. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, you know, when we talk about these swings, when we have things go from liberal to standard to restrictive. There's always that thought process, and I'll tell you that I don't feel comfortable with things like the bear issues. That's pretty clear. But Russell, I do appreciate what you've done to explain the Bobcat stuff. It's given me coming in, I wasn't sure where I felt. I mean, I was very concerned about the numbers. I think that's clearly NDOW is too. That's why the adjustment. So I do feel like that the thought process and the data that the department's following it, and I appreciate the conversation. So I'll be supporting the motion, even though I have concerns, and I don't think anybody would deny that that those are some pretty low numbers and concerning. But I appreciate that there's other things that we're watching, so I'll be supporting the motion, even though I still have some concerns with some of the reproduction and stuff.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 8-0 with Commissioner Caviglia absent. With that, we'll close agenda item 16 and move on to agenda item 17. Okay, agenda item 17, Upland Game Bird Stamp Request, Wildlife Staff Specialist Sean Espinoza and Division Administrator Alan Janae for possible action. The Commission will review and may take action to approve up to $264,840 for projects submitted for fiscal year 2021 funding from the Upland Game Bird Stamp account. The specific Upland Game Bird Stamp projects that may be approved are listed below. By state, Sage-Grouse Coordinator, $5,000. Dusky Grouse Ecology and Management in Nevada, $22,003. Eastern Complex WMA Weed Control, $10,000. Estimating greater Sage-Grouse vital rates within Nevada's novel habitats, $21,250. Estimating the effects of large ungulate grazing or greater sage-grouse in northwestern Nevada, $18,397. Greater sage-grouse statewide monitoring, $47,640. Key Pittman Wildlife Management Area wildlife food plots, $3,900. Monitoring greater sage-grouse response to the Martin Fire, $12,750. Monitoring the effects of landscape level treatments on greater sage-grouse in the Desatoya Mountains, $19,500. Soil health restoration on WMAs, $10,000. Upland game translocation and monitoring, $12,400. Using hunter and population survey data to investigate drivers of upland game, bird populations and forecast harvest in Nevada, $24,600. Janet Creek conservation easement, $30,000. Toyabe PMU Bakes, Hickson, and Wolf Ranch Pinyon Juniper Thinning, $25,000. A multi-scale resilience-based framework for restoring and conserving Great Basin wet meadows and riparian ecosystems, $2,400. Mr. Espinoza. I don't believe your mic's on.
Just turn it on. Turn it to a turn screen.
On now, I think. Thank you, Chairman Johnson. Sean Espinoza, Upland Game Staff Specialist, for the record. You listed off the projects there. The total amount came to $264,840, which would have allowed us to access $1.7 million in other funds, matching funds for those projects. Administrator Alan Janae at the Habitat Division informed me that there is one project that has been withdrawn. That is the Genetic Creek Conservation Easement Project, which was proposed for $30,000 of Upland Game Stamp money. That project has been fully funded at this point, so the match amount of $30,000 is no longer required. That would bring our total request down to $234,840. and that would allow access to 776,298 of other matching sources of funds. So total project cost of around $1 million. At this point, you have the support material in hand, which describes each one of those projects, as well as the progress reports from the previous upland game stamp projects that we had over the last fiscal year. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions, Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the one question I had is on the project that was pulled, and I was just curious, what was NAS's involvement? That was just a large chunk of money, and I was just curious what they...
For the record, Alan Janae, Habitat Division Administrator. The Fallon Naval Air Station was involved. They have a program, a funding program for military influence lands called the REPI program. Right now, the full explanation of that acronym is escaping me, but they can fund projects in the areas that are, influenced by their aircraft, and so that area extends clear out to the rubies associated with Fallon Naval Air Station. So they have some funding, and they were kicking in to help fund that conservation easement for the benefit of sage-grouse.
Thank you. I haven't heard a lot about it, but I get the sense that it was a lot of work and a long time coming, so congratulations on having that one done.
Thank you.
Additional comments? Commissioner Hubbs?
Okay, I'm gonna have to go through my notes really slowly so my papers don't go away. I have some comments though. Not comments, questions. Some positive, if I get there. So most of the sage-grouse surveys were done in April, correct?
Are you asking the question regarding for the last fiscal year progress reports?
For 2019.
For
So we're in 2020, so we did April. No, so I'm asking for this year. Because I think most of the surveys, Mr. Espinoza, occurred in April 2020, correct? For 2020 year.
most of the surveys this year for greater sage-grouse occurred in March. A lot of field crews left the field April 1st for some of the research projects that we have. Some of them continued a little bit further into April, but as I mentioned that we had some consultants and other folks in the field in April that allowed us to at least get some LEC data in hand.
Oh. And I just wanted to make sure for the record that we can hear Mr. Espinoza and myself and the rest of the commission as we move forward with all of this wind, because there's an extremely large amount of wind, and I want to note that for the record.
Yeah, if everyone would place their mouths closer to the microphones and speak up, the microphones that are at the commission tables I think work better than that one, and so certainly if you want to borrow mine, I wouldn't hurt my feelings one bit.
Mine too is free. So obviously I brought up this commission at this last year's commission meeting, obviously my concern for the sage-grouse, and what was interesting in the sage-grouse data was, first and foremost, let me just kind of put together what I thought of the report, Mr. Espinoza, was that obviously, unfortunately, for this field season, after the last field season where we had a lot of snow and weather in our surveys. So we had a lot of snow and weather in our surveys, so we were trying to get this information and data on the sage-grouse, and it was difficult to obtain. So then we go into this season for 2020, and we get hit with a pandemic. We can't hire state appropriated individuals to kind of come out and assist with surveys, and so we're taxed with the fact that we have to survey our sage-grouse under these conditions. I just want to lead it into that because it seemed difficult. Is that correct?
Yes, you are correct, Commissioner. This is very difficult. I mentioned those different sources of data that we are able to acquire. In addition to that, we're able to hire a Waihi Air, a private contractor, to perform forward-looking infrared surveys across the state as well. But that is only a minimal amount of data compared to what we're normally accustomed to getting. As of last week, we had about 760 Lex able to obtain for this year. Normally, we're in the realm of about 2,270 LEC observations, so we're about 28% of what we would normally get on a normal year.
Understandably. So, understandably, I mean, it's concerning to me. I don't want to note that it is not, but understandably, if you don't have the people flying over or on the field, and you have all these ramifications that we have been through, correct? One of the interesting things about the data that I was seeing is the movement of Lex. Like, I know it seemed to me that there was this interest in understanding where future Lex might occur. And there were some future Lex, or different Lex, we'll just say that, unknown Lex, that were found, which was interesting. But you'd hope to find more. But understandably, under the circumstances, you can't do that probing. So I'm left with this really weird assumption as to what to think of all this, because we've had the really bad winter years, and then we had the new pandemic. We had less new Lex than we thought we might have found, given the methodology provided. And we had some areas where there were really dismal survey data generated. So I just wanted to understand, I mean, having read your report, what your thoughts are, how you feel this sage-grouse is doing in the state. Do you think it's just cataclysm of circumstances? Do you think we might see something different next year if things get better for us, or what your thoughts are?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner Hub. Sean Espinoza, Upland Game Staff Specialist for the record. There is no doubt that sage-grouse populations are declining in the state of Nevada, and it's due to multiple things. Everything from fire to what's going on with anthropogenic disturbance in the state to climate, which is more or less the general driver. But when you start introducing other things into the landscape for a species, even though it's landscape scale species, it needs vast amount of habitat to carry out its life cycle. And when you interrupt that, either through fragmentation, a large fire, a transmission line that may harbor numbers of ravens that will prey on eggs or even chicks, it has a cascading effect through the population. I guess the short answer to your question is sage-grouse populations are declining. I'm not seeing a lot of things happening on the landscape that are going to change that right now. We have done an extreme amount of effort with our habitat division and working with others to try and restore these burned areas. Some of that has worked, but that is only part and parcel to the immense amount of habitat that we have lost. In 2018, 2 fires generated a total loss of 770,000 acres. We were able to restore maybe 80 to 100,000 acres of that amount of fire. There's no doubt that that's going to have a long-term impact. The way that habitat is going to recover, some of it's going to recover naturally, but the replacement of that habitat with cheatgrass is, for the Great Basin, that's our number one threat, but we have a lot of other threats that are occurring on the landscape right now. I have not seen the amount of mining activity on the landscape that I've seen in the last 5 years. And vehicle traffic to and from mines, the mining activity itself, the amount of noise created by mines and associated activity, other features on the landscape that create noise. you have this situation where you've got fire within and on the periphery of the habitat, and within the habitat you have these anthropogenic disturbances, and it's having an effect that I'm not confident we're going to be able to recover from. Honest answer.
That's very concerning to me, Mr. Espinoza, because you've always been very straightforward and very optimistic with our state's initiatives and things that are going on in the landscape. And I think we should all consider that. I mean, hunting is really a minor issue in this matter. It seems like we're standing by our guidelines in terms of how many sage-grouse can be hunted. I mean, that's a totally different issue, but my bigger question is, what are we going to do moving forward? Because I believe this is urgent. And if you look at the bigger picture, this is very urgent for our state. We have to put a lot of funds here. We have sage-grouse habitat at issue. We have a sagebrush obligate at issue federally, and we don't know what will happen with the new administration. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that we see a lot of additional mining right now. That does not surprise me. And that does not surprise me that it's harmful to what's going on. But in another, year or so, things may be very different. And do we want to keep control of our own wildlife populations in the state? Or do we want to lose control over that to the federal government if we don't take initiative? And I think this is a really important question right now. And I think when I read these reports every year, we need to really be aware of what is going on and what are we going to do. I mean, the survey results are very poor, and it's not because you don't have a professional report and you don't put forth the survey efforts. That's not the issue. I think what you're really seeing is real-time data, and I'm wondering, what is our state going to do here? I think it's really important to address this as well.
Yeah, just a final comment related to the question. The state now has a conservation credit system in place. They have a mandatory mitigation program by law that any sort of industrial development has to follow. There's a habitat quantification tool that estimates the acres of disturbance, the acres of loss, and that has to be offset with acres preserved, enhanced elsewhere. The issue at hand, and I think the issue for the West, are these mitigation programs going to be effective at sustaining sage-grouse populations in the long term? Are they going to generate a lift for sage-grouse populations? We're early in the phases of mitigation for the species. In some cases, it could help, but the jury is still out on how effective those mitigation practices are going to be.
Okay, I appreciate the broad discussion, but we need to stay focused on the upland game bird stamp request. That's the agenda item. That's the items we need to address. This is a very worthwhile discussion, and discussion needs to continue, but I would like to remain focused on what is presented to the commission right now for consideration. So let's focus on if there's questions for Mr. Espinoza regarding the specific upland game bird stamp request for the funds. And if there's no questions on that, we can take it to public comment, but I see questions from Vice Chair East and then Commissioner Keel.
Thank you. Sean, with the recommendation to remove the Genetti Creek $30,000, do you have a recommendation where you would allocate that money? Could we put it toward another project, and do you have enough money? Never enough money, right?
I appreciate the question, Commissioner East. Sean Espinoza for the record. I haven't really thought that far in advance since I was just notified of that about 30 minutes ago. I guess I would ask Administrator Alan Janae if he has any suggestions on this.
Commissioner Barnes had something to do with this. He'll probably not come clean on the record.
So, again, this is Janae, Habitat Division Administrator. Definitely, you know, you don't have to spend into the balance.
You got to speak into your microphone or we're not going to hear you. Okay?
It's probably off. He probably touched it.
I think you turned it off. The little guy with
Okay.
There you go.
I got carried away. There you go. So, you don't have to spend it in account balance. It could actually accumulate within the account and be available for future funding awards. It doesn't have any penalty or be lost to future potential. If Sean doesn't have any mention of projects that he'd like to see, I mean, there is another Pinyon Juniper project in here, which is the Bates Hickerson. There's always the capability to add extra acres to a treatment such as that. So that's the only one I could really think of right off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Keel.
The vice chair stole my thunder on that one.
Sorry. Did you have another question? Commissioner Keel?
The vice chair asked the exact question that I was going to.
Speak into the microphone, please. Okay. Any additional questions? Commissioner Hubbs.
Of course, I have some questions. Sorry, Chairman Johnston, this is your last meeting with me.
No,
so
there's no need to
you have
apologize.
to just give me some leeway. But one of the interesting things came to me in this and these reportings is that our leks move about, right? Either they're moving about or new leks are being generated and old leks are being abandoned. Or old leks that we think are the leks are not visited. But you're finding new leks. Do you think that there's just movement of this population of sage-grouse? I listened to this very interesting piece. It was rethinking the migration of all living things. It was on NPR by Sonia Shaw. And it reminded me of your report in that thinking that our wildlife just stays stagnant. It does not. It's very dynamic, obviously. So leks are moving. We're trying to find new leks. Should we be concerned, too, that potentially we're just not tracking movement instead of numbers at this point?
So thanks for the question, Commissioner Hubbs. Several years ago, we developed a model of lekking habitat across the state in order to look at places that fit the bill, but we missed over the years. And for many years, if you looked at lek locations back in the 80s, a lot of them were closely correlated to roads because those were the places that were accessible. So over the past several years, we've spent more time trying to conduct the infrared surveys with an aircraft, getting at high elevation habitats in large part that we can't get to and places away from roads. And we have had some success at finding areas that a new lek exists on the landscape. And I would say that that's a success, but in terms of population trend, we continue to use our trend leks. So those are the leks that are long-term, have had activity long-term. We use those more or less to estimate trends in populations and track how birds are doing.
Oh, so, Mr. Espinosa, are you seeing any old birds known at new leks? That's my question to you, too.
It occurs, but it's kind of the exception rather than the rule. They're pretty fidelic to certain lek sites. There's a small percentage of movement that we have documented where there are interlek movements. Females will move more than males, but I would say as a general rule, less than 10% of the males move between leks, but it can happen.
So I have a lot of questions on this report, but it's getting really windy, and I don't want to.
This is just a slight breeze for Mason Valley.
Yeah, well, my RV the thing flew up, Brad, for you. Because I came down here in my RV, it flew up over my RV. And I have to report that back to my rental company.
I can't hear you, but I'm sorry. Okay, do you have additional questions? I don't want to cut off questions. I just would like the questions focused on the upland game stamp request so we can move through the agenda.
Questions. First of all, let's just be really quick about it. Do you think that the tracking methodology through Pinpoint Tech should be changed?
I'm sorry, what was the question, Commissioner Hubbs?
The technology through low-tech Pinpoint technology be changed, because when you're doing the other Sage-Grouse, and none of them seem to all be lost.
And so that might be a question related to our dusky grouse research project. We have had some issues with that particular brand of transmitter in the past, and we have ceased use of those transmitters.
I have another question on the technology used for the infrared or whatever's being used to monitor the bodies. How do we know those are sage-grouse? Can you just briefly describe that? Is that surety that it's sage-grouse, or could we be measuring other bird species or mammals on the ground?
So the video that's taken, you can actually see the bird strutting. So it's a pretty compelling, and there is a certain signature that the technician in the aircraft is looking for as well. But when you see the video, it's pretty compelling evidence that we even did that with our sharp-tails this year, and there's no question that they're sharp-tail grouse looking at the way they acted in the video.
Those were all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. Any additional questions? Seeing none, any public comment on the upland game bird stamp requests? They'll bring the mic to you, Mr. Mandeville.
Yeah, hold it close. All right. Hope you guys are doing well today. Anyhow, I wanted to make a couple comments about sage-grouse. And I've been retired for about 18 years. And I watch sage-grouse populations wane, and basically disappear. And one sage-grouse population that I was observing, I observed from a real estate sign that they were developing up at Desert Creek. So there's a lot of new homes up there. And that's going on all over the place. Wind farms is another issue, with the people that go up and down the road maintaining those mills. Really has a major impact on the sage-grouse.
If you could speak up a little bit more, I'd appreciate it.
I wanted to say that anyhow. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
That's much better.
That wind is doing a number on us. I don't know if you heard me say that I observed sage-grouse strutting from a real estate sign on Desert Creek many years ago. And I'll tell you what, you can't find a sage-grouse up in that area today. And of course, wind farms are not much better. With those giant wind farms that they're putting up in eastern Nevada and other places, they're a heck of a neat way to produce electricity. But with all the activity on those mill sites, the sage-grouse are not going to do very well. At least, and that's my opinion. I appreciate your listening to me, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comment? Seeing no additional public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission for a further discussion or a motion. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make a motion to approve the upland game bird stamp requests as presented, with the exception that the money from the Jeanette Creek project, which has been completed, be rolled over into the Toyabe PMU, Bakes, Hickson, and Wolf Ranch Pinyon Juniper thinning project.
I'll second that.
Okay, I have a Commissioner Barnes.
Yes, you do have a motion in a second, but just so everybody's aware, I'm directly involved with the Jeanette Creek project, and so I was going to have to abstain. Since that project has been removed from this, I'm going to go ahead and vote on it.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? Okay, it's a motion by Commissioner Menken, seconded by Commissioner Valentine to approve the upland game bird stamp requests as presented with one exception. The $30,000 that was requested for the Genetic Creek, which has been fully funded, will be added to the Toyabe PMU Pinyon Juniper Thinning. Is everybody clear on the motion?
I am, Chairman Johnson, but I just don't fully understand just what is the Genetic Creek project. Could we just put it on record really quickly in a brief?
It was a conservation easement.
And where was that located?
Someone answer where that?
It's in the Ruby Mountains.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think we've got somebody that's being pretty humble about the project, and at the future agenda items, I was going to ask for an agenda item on this, maybe get a little more, a little broader look at it, and maybe give some kudos where they might not be asking for them.
Okay. Okay. So it's a conservation easement in the Ruby Mountains.
Okay, that sounds good. I just want to get it on record, and we know one of our commissioners was involved in it, but it's been fully funded at this point in time, so we all feel confident that we're voting on it, correct?
We're voting on...
Or on that and the additional projects presented.
No, we're not voting to fund the conservation easement because that's already been fully funded. That $30,000 is going to the Pinyon Juniper Thinning in the Toyabe PMU.
Okay, understood.
Okay. Everybody clear on the motion? All right. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 8-0. What we're going to do, we're going to try to move just slightly over there, but closer to the building in the shade. I think with this wind, if we're over by the structure, we can still be distanced, but hopefully it'll cut some of that wind down to make it a little bit more manageable to move through this meeting. I suspect that might take about 15-20 minutes, so we'll reconvene at noon. Thank you.